The main character was a blind boy named George. People in the town said he was the most pitiful child there. His father, Hasan, had fallen in love with a young widow and wanted to marry her to start a new life. But George's existence became an obstacle he couldn't get around. After a long inner struggle, Hasan had a terrifying thought. He decided to stage an accident and make his son disappear forever. The river was fast and violent. The moment George was swept away, Hasan stood on the riverbank, his emotions in chaos. Was he heading toward heaven or falling into hell? Even he couldn't tell anymore. Time rewound to that summer. George had spent a term at a school for the blind and was finally waiting for the day he could go home. One by one, the children were picked up by their parents, the noise slowly faded, and in the end he was the only one left standing there. He waited from morning until afternoon. Even the birds had returned to their nests, but his father still hadn't shown up. When Hasan finally arrived, he didn't come to greet him. He just stood far away with no warmth on his face, only helplessness, even a trace of disgust. What hurt even more was that Hasan went straight to the principal's office. He asked if George could stay at the school permanently because he didn't want to take him home. The principal found it absurd and refused immediately. The school wasn't a shelter. With no choice, Hasan reluctantly went back to George with a stiff expression. He called his son's name. His voice was cold and distant, but to George, it felt like a beam of light. It washed away all his anxiety from the entire day. In his mind, his father was just busy, not abandoning him. He followed the sound, reached out his small hands into the air, and finally grabbed his father's hand. On the drive home, George was full of excitement. The wind rushed through the car window and blew through his hair. He kept sticking his hand out, feeling the wind between his fingers, asking non-stop questions. He had so much he wanted to tell his dad. But Hasan didn't want to hear any of it. He gave short, impatient replies, his face full of irritation. On the country road, George let go of his father's hand and ran freely through the fields. He couldn't see the path, but he knew the land well. Hasan followed behind him, calling out, "A little left, a little right." For once he almost looked like a real father. The journey home was long. They crossed streams and climbed hills, and the familiar scent of home slowly grew stronger. George kept shouting and laughing, his voice echoing through the fields and mountains. His sisters, who were working in the fields, heard him and ran over immediately. He gently touched his younger sister's face and smiled. "You've grown so much." The three siblings ran and laughed along the mountain path. The sisters rushed to tell their grandmother George was back. The grandmother hurried outside, moving faster than usual. She had missed her grandson for a whole year. George hid behind a tree trying to surprise her, but he didn't know she had already seen him, her eyes already filled with tears. He slowly followed her voice, reached out his hands and held hers. Then he led her to sit down and took out a long-prepared gift from his pocket, a beautiful hair clip. He gave it to her. The grandmother was overjoyed and immediately pinned it to her clothes. But as she smiled, sadness crept in. How cruel life was, to take this child's sight away. His sisters came over too, and he gave them gifts as well. A necklace made of bottle caps for his sister and a small comb for the other. The grandmother took him to the sapling they had planted the year before. Even though he couldn't see it, he touched it gently. Then they went to the wheat field. The grandmother guided his hands across the soft wheat heads, letting him feel each one, even counting the grains for him. This was what he had been waiting for all year. On the other side, Hasan returned home and immediately shaved, tidied himself up, and rushed to see the widow. He had recently met a widow from a nearby village. They got along well and decided to start a new family together. He had already brought the engagement gift, and her family was satisfied, more eager than even he was for the wedding. But there was one problem. What about George? Hasan knew he couldn't let his future wife know he had a blind son. That night, he spoke to his mother about finding a solution. He pretended it was all out of concern for the child. But his mother saw through him immediately. Hasan had nothing to say and walked away in silence. George knew nothing. He lived immersed in nature, touching flowers, listening to birds, smelling the earth. He couldn't see colors or obstacles, but he wasn't anxious. He built his world through touch and sound. Though blind, his hearing was extraordinary. Birdsong in the trees sounded like music to him. He seemed to understand every note. His grandmother stayed by his side every day, loving and protecting him. But Hasan only grew more irritated. He feared this blind child would ruin his plans for a new life. One day, George wanted to go to school with his sisters. To make it possible, the grandmother went to the school and asked the teacher. The teacher brought George into the classroom and asked who wanted to sit with him. Every single child raised their hand. He sat down and began class. When the teacher asked them to read the text, George read from his braille book. He read quickly and accurately, shocking the entire class. No one knew that every raised dot in his book had been punched by his own hands. What others learned in a day took him months. Hasan happened to see this when he returned from the engagement visit. At home, he immediately blamed the grandmother harshly. He claimed it was because of trouble, but in reality, he feared George would grow attached to the school and refuse to return to the blind school far away. The grandmother said nothing, but her disappointment in her son deepened. A few days later, when the grandmother wasn't home, Hasan secretly took George away. When she returned and found him gone, her heart sank. She never imagined that her last glimpse of her grandson would truly be the last. Hasan took George to the seaside. He set up a wooden post and tied a rope, telling him to stay on one side and play. Then he walked away pretending to work, hoping for an accident. But fate didn't cooperate. George was drawn to the sound of seagulls and stayed still, listening carefully, never stepping forward. When the plan failed, Hasan brought him back to camp. Strange animal cries echoed in the forest, deep and unsettling, like the beast inside Hasan waking up. He saw George stumbling toward the woods, while his own face twisted in conflict. Soon a passing worker pulled George back. Hasan lowered his head, whether from shame or disappointment even he didn't know. When accidents kept failing, Hasan chose another method. He led George toward the roadside. Hearing distant traffic, George finally sensed something wrong. Frightened, George broke free and ran back. But a blind child had nowhere to go. In the end, Hasan took him to a blind carpenter he had already arranged in advance. He handed George over and turned away without looking back. George didn't cry. He didn't shout. He said nothing at all. It was as if he already knew this would happen. The carpenter guided him, teaching him to feel different kinds of wood. Then suddenly, a tear fell onto George's hand. The carpenter realized how heartbreakingly quiet this child was. News returned to the village. The grandmother, hearing George had been sent away, rushed out into the pouring rain. Hasan stopped her, shouting about his own struggles, insisting he just wanted to live his life. She said nothing, only looked at him with a shattered, silent gaze and kept walking. But not long after, she collapsed on the muddy road. Hasan carried her home. He asked if bringing George back would make her better, but she was more worried about her son, who had lost his conscience to desire, than about her fate-bound grandson. Her words didn't wake Hasan. The next day, he still used all his savings to send the dowry. That night, he lied again, saying he had visited George and that the boy was doing fine. The grandmother didn't expose him. She simply gave him all her lifelong savings and jewelry. Hasan thought she had finally understood him. He didn't know it was all meant for the child. One morning, George woke to the wind and birdsong. Far away, an old woman was thinking of him. In her final moments, she seemed to see her beloved grandson. And then she passed away with deep disappointment. Soon after, the engagement was called off. Hasan had nothing left. Eventually, he decided to go bring George back. But this time, his face was calm, empty, like still water. On the way back, a wooden bridge collapsed. George fell into the raging river with the horse. Hasan stood on the bank, frozen, watching the scene he had imagined countless times. Now that it was real, he hesitated. But in the end, conscience took over. He jumped in. The current was too strong. He couldn't save anyone, not even himself. He grabbed a tree branch, gasping for breath, and saw one of George's shoes floating nearby. That small shoe reflected everything he had become. He let go, drifted away. After what felt like a long time, seagulls woke him from unconsciousness. He struggled to his feet and saw a small figure near the river mouth. He ran over and picked George up, but it was already a cold, lifeless body. Seagulls circled above, crying out endlessly, like a farewell song and like a judgment. George had never seen the colors of this world. He had wanted so little. A word of praise, a simple, "Let's go home." But the father he waited for never came. A final light fell on his hand. It was the grandmother coming to take him home, and to tell him she had never abandoned him. George's life was a tragedy written by those closest to him. And in the end, what was lost was not just the child, but everyone who chose desire over love.